Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel Schwammenthal. I'm the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for this conversation with David Harris, Executive Vice Chair of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping notes. In the unlikely event of a fire alarm, please leave the room from the exit over there, where I'm pointing. When you turn around, walk calmly to your left, leave the synagogue and cross the street and gather in front, of course, the church. I wanted to welcome you here for this conversation. Just a few notes. David and I will be in conversation for about 45, 60 minutes. And before we open the floor to your questions, and the program will end around 9 p.m. And David was so kind to agree to stick around a little longer and sign copies of his book. In the interest of full disclosure, David and I have known each other for many years. David used to be my boss, my mentor, and is still a very, very dear friend. I would like to introduce him a little bit to you. The late Shimon Peres once called David the foreign minister of the Jewish people. And during the years where we overlapped at the American Jewish Committee, and one of the major American Jewish organizations David led for several decades, I had the opportunity to witness our chief diplomat in action. And whenever I had the opportunity to join his meetings, and he would meet with presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, monarchs from around the globe, I had the privilege to witness really a masterclass in diplomacy and advocacy. And so for all these reasons, the opportunity for me to interview David tonight is both a professional privilege and a personal honor. He has written several hundred, probably, of op-eds during his career, has written several books, and most recently, this one, Antisemitism, What Everybody Needs to Know. And it is perhaps here that we can start the conversation, David. No doubt, given the surge of anti-Semitism in many ways, for you, the decision to write this book is almost self-evident. At the same time, as you point out in your book as well, this is the longest hatred. There are entire libraries already on this topic. What made you decide to add this book to the bookshelves?
Good evening. Thank you, first of all, to my friend and colleague, Daniel Schwammenthal, for moderating. Thank you to the Jewish Chronicle for hosting. Thank you to the synagogue for the venue. The truth of the matter is, Daniel, the book was not my idea. In the fall of 2023, I received a phone call from someone who identified herself as the executive editor of Oxford University Press. And she said to me, "I'd like you to write a book for us." In my own place in life, that only happened in dreams. Usually you're at the other end of trying to beg a press to take interest in an idea you had. And so my initial reaction, quite honestly, was to think this was a prank call by one of my daughters-in-law or granddaughters. And I acted as if it were a prank call fortunately, to the credit of OUP, they didn't hang up on me and go to the next name on their list. But they said to me, many books have been written on the subject, most of them scholarly. Anti-Semitism today appears to be surging, and we need a book that is accessible, I think I'm quoting her correctly, to the average New York Times reader. Meaning, we don't want scholarly debates, we don't want excessive semicolons. We want a book that's written not just for Jews, but especially for non-Jews, that's easy to read, and that says very clearly, both descriptively and prescriptively, how to grapple with this resurgent issue.
Now, you dedicated this book both to your lovely, formidable wife, Juju, who is in the audience, and to your late parents. And all three of them and their families escaped murderous anti-Semitism on different continents. Can you talk to us a little bit about how their experiences has affected your career, your mission, but also how you addressed this book?
So, though I spent 50 years as a soldier, if you will, in the Jewish army, my understanding of anti-Semitism began with the three people in my life closest to me, as Daniel said. My mother was born in Moscow. She and her family were among the very last to be able to leave the Soviet Union under Stalin, and landed in France, as both Jews and Romanovs and others often did, and lived in France for 11 years with a New Start until the Maginot Line failed. And France fell in June of 1940. And then again, like many, they were on the move. They were among the fortunate ones after 17 months of hiding and fleeing to be able to cross the Pyrenees. So I learned from my mother the dangers of both fascism and communism. My father was a student of atomic physics at the University of Vienna when the Anschluss took place in 1938, and he was expelled from the university, though I believe that the work he was doing was on a trajectory perhaps for a Nobel Prize in physics, not just for him, but if you will, for Austria. But his Jewish identity trumped that. And I won't take you through the next 7 years of his life, but he arrived in the United States only after the Second World War. And my wife, who's been introduced to you, was born and raised in Libya and spent the first 16 plus years of her life with her 7 siblings, her parents, 34 first cousins in Libya. And in June of 1967, the pogroms began. My wife and her family were faced with death. They were rescued. They were in hiding for a couple of weeks. And then the Italian ambassador in Libya helped escort them out. So, if you will, Daniel, my introduction to the subject of anti-Semitism wasn't through the university, it wasn't through the academy, it wasn't through scholarship. It was through, if you will, the PhDs in life experiences that the three people closest to me had. And the implication of this was, from the beginning, a very swivel-headed approach to anti-Semitism. For a very long time, I speak particularly from an American perspective, but though Daniel didn't mention it, and though my accent doesn't reveal it, I spent some 4 years of my life in this country in graduate and postgraduate studies. and feel a very close connection to the UK. But from an American perspective, anti-Semitism was being politicized and weaponized early on. The left using it against the right using it against the left, and lots of people tiptoeing around the subject of jihadist anti-Semitism. Again, simply from my own exposure to my mother, my father, and my wife's experiences, instinctively, I took a 360-degree approach because there was no other way for me to disentangle the experiences that each of them had. Real life, life-threatening consequences for the sole reason of having been born Jews.
David, we just heard it from your brief biography that you here presented, is that you often call yourself Europe's unwanted son. You have spent several decades fighting anti-Semitism as a proud Jew, but also as a proud American. And I want to ask you how you explain that in this rise of anti-Semitism across the West, the United States considered to be an exceptional country in this way. Not that anti-Semitism was unknown in the United States, but it was never, as you describe in the book, it was never based in law. And if you look at the founding fathers who had a great affinity to the Hebrew Bible, to Judaism, to the Jewish people, there was a very different experience for Jews. How do you explain, before we begin to delve deeper into the various issues, how this phenomenon has struck now also what we often call the golden Medina?
Well, if I can break that down, Daniel, to first Europe, because you mentioned Europe, and then the US. Otherwise, you may not, but I'll be here till morning. We, Daniel and I were colleagues for many years. We saw the issues in Europe early, and we began conversations with European leaders early. I'm talking about the late 90s, 2000, 2001, and thereafter. And I, time permitting, I could actually almost quote for you some of the exchanges we had with Europe's leaders about the emerging issue of anti-Semitism, including Jacques Chirac, the president of France. I can still picture sitting in his private office in the Élysée Palace and having this exchange with him where he insisted, I can hear his words in French, not to mention the translation, where the president of France looked at us as Jews in France began to wonder if they had a future and whether the state would protect them. He looked at us and he said to us, "My friends, I know my country better than you. There is no problem with anti-Semitism in France." And when we met with Hubert Védrine, who was the foreign minister at the time, separately, he took it a step further and he said, essentially, "My friends, mes amis, the problem is not anti-Semitism, it is the, quote, regrettable importation of the Arab-Israeli conflict onto French soil." And then added as well, hooliganism as another explanatory factor. In other words, as anti-Semitism resurfaced, and we can delve deeper into why it did and how it did, the initial reaction from the continent, which had shouted from the rooftops after 1945, never again, who insisted that the birth of the European project the coal and steel community, to be followed by the European Union, was a response to and a repudiation of war on European soil, including the Shoah, that many of the very same European leaders refused to see what was staring them in the face. There's an asterisk to that. And I come back to what I said earlier, Daniel, about the 360-degree perspective. If they were willing to see anything at all, it was extreme right-wing, neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. That was easy for them to denounce. The truth of the matter is that as problematic as that was and is, in those years, that was not the principal issue in Western Europe, certainly. The principal issue was the combination of left-wing anti-Zionism and jihadist anti-Semitism. And there, too many politicians, if I may, and I know I'm going into what we call a third rail discussion, too many politicians were unwilling to call out jihadist anti-Semitism, not from, but from within communities that had landed in Europe. And when it came to left-wing anti-Semitism for electoral and other reasons, which you know very well, they entered into, if you will, Talmudic debates, endless debates about the degree Zionism was or was not anti-Semitism. Even when it became painfully obvious that those who were prepared to deny the legitimacy of only one nation on earth and never question the sovereign right of other nations on earth, most of which, by the way, were created by what? Invasion, conquest, or colonial map makers, including in this city right here. Take a country like Jordan. Take Libya. Take the United States of America. Take Australia. I can keep going down a very long list. When their sole obsessive, neurotic preoccupation is with the legitimacy of one nation on earth, which happens to be the only Jewish majority nation on earth, something is going on here. But those discussions were relegated to the sidelines. And so the problem that we faced practically was, how could we, as friends of Europe, who were not in Europe to malign European leaders to their face, but to seek to alert European leaders to the emerging challenges and to try and nip them in the bud before they metastasized, knowing something about the history of anti-Semitism, how could we wake them up to the 360-degree threat? And frankly, Daniel, as you know very well, especially from your work in Brussels, it took much longer than it should have on a continent which should have been the very first to understand the slippery slope of anti-Semitism and where it can lead.
So take us from your work, as you described. You came for many years. You came from the United States to Europe to alert European leaders about the rise of anti-Semitism and your frustration, as you described, that they for way too long did not even want to acknowledge the problem. To the question that I earlier asked, how do you explain this, from my perspective, incredibly sudden, not arrival, but manifestation of anti-Semitism in a particularly also rather intense and if not vicious form in the country where we would have it at least expected?
Let's begin with this statement of fact. The first Jews arrived in what today is the US in 1654. 24 Jews from Recife, Brazil, fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition, came to what was then called New Amsterdam, today New York. From that day, 1654, until the year 2017, 300 and some odd years, there were fewer murders of Jews as Jews than from 2018 until today. That's what's changed in the United States. Statistically, but not only statistically.
Wait, repeat this. In the last 8 years?
From the year 1654 to the year 2017, which is what, 363 years? Someone can help me with the math, perhaps. There were fewer Jews on American soil murdered for being Jewish than in the last 7.5 years.
That's an incredible statistic.
So what happened to the country where the first president of the United States had this remarkable letter, which if you haven't read, you should one day read, to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. And then he had a second letter to a congregation in the South, in which he spoke about the nature of this new country, and not just its tolerance. For me, the word tolerance should be deleted from our vocabulary. It sets the bar way too low for the way I believe we should be interacting with each other. That set the tone. And as you said, the founding fathers, and they were principally fathers, men, many of whom were deists, drew their inspiration from the Hebrew Bible. The overlay of Jewish biblical imagery and symbolism and values on this new country, the United States, is quite profound. It's very, very deep. So this country began on a very different starting point than, shall I say, the countries of Europe, if I can generalize, where it took centuries and centuries until principally the 19th century, until Jews were somehow normalized, or at least the beginning of the process of normalization began. This was the way America started itself, saw itself. So what's changed? Well, I think at moments like this, Daniel, we need to pull no punches here. We need to be very honest and open. Lots has changed. Obviously, one thing that has changed dramatically is social media. I mean, I ask myself, it's not an original question, if Joseph Goebbels had access to the kind of social media available today to demagogues of all stripes and flavors, how much more catastrophic might it have been with clever Nazi manipulation of messaging tailored to various audiences, number one. Number two, migration patterns. There are those who still want to live in a kind of rose-colored bubble. In the United States, I speak. We ourselves were immigrants. We ourselves were refugees. We ourselves saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time crossing the ocean to New York Harbor. We ourselves were at Ellis Island together with this melange of people from so many parts of the world. So how can we dare raise questions about others who come to our country? And yet, if we don't ask the question in the US, and for that matter in much of Europe, about about 3 topics, Daniel, which you and I talked about and which you acted upon in Brussels somewhat 10, 12 years ago, what we call the 3 I's. Remember? Immigration, but what about the other 2 I's? Integration and identity. Discussion of immigration without conversation about integration and identity is an insufficient discussion to have. And we all know why. The third point, and this is what attracted me to ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which I joined some 3 years ago after leaving the American Jewish Committee, stepping down. There was something deeper and darker happening as well. And I thought that too many were missing those deeper, darker forces. It really came down to 3 words: follow the money. What explains why those of us who are products of American universities of my generation, or of the generation of now of our adult children, went through those universities, if you will, unscarred intellectually, much less ideologically? And what explains the fact that on October the 8th, 2023, in other words, the day after the invasion of Israel, literally 24 hours later, 34 student groups at America's preeminent university, Harvard, came together and declared that Israel and Israel alone was responsible for the barbarism that was inflicted against Israelis on October the 7th. What had happened? And ISGAP, to its everlasting credit, was asking the questions about money trails. And why in particular, one tiny country with fewer than 350,000 citizens, thousands of miles away from Harvard and Stanford and Princeton and Yale and the other marquee institutions, had become the principal foreign funder of American higher education. And that country? Qatar. Why? Were they really interested in advancing understanding of architectural studies, or French literature, or mathematics? Was something else going on? And I saw too many others, well-intentioned people, Jews and non-Jews, who were approaching a cancerous situation by putting first aid cream on the spots, or reinforcing their pre-October 7th agenda. Maybe we haven't explained ourselves well enough as Jews. Maybe we need to add more interfaith Passover Seders or inter-ethnic Passover Seders, or maybe we need to host an iftar dinner, all to show, once again, that as Jews, we were not a mystery. We were eager partners and friends and allies. And ISGAP revealed, and now it's become part of the American vocabulary, follow the money. Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood. The President of the United States recently issued executive orders, which have the force of law, banning Muslim Brotherhood chapters in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Why? Some asked, the Muslim Brotherhood sounds like the Islamic fraternal equivalent of B'nai B'rith. But with the help of ISGAP, and then the power of the US government, as they dug deeper and asked the same questions, this outburst of anti-Semitism, did it just happen spontaneously? Or Was there something else going on? The networking, the planning, the funding. And the final thing I'd say for starters, Daniel, it's obviously a deeper question, and also if I answer it fully, you have no incentive to read the book. I would argue that the consequences for this change in behavior in the United States were few and far between. For one thing, anti-Semitism on the, if you will, the ladder of phobias and isms barely made it. And when it was mentioned, it was rarely mentioned singularly. It was usually lumped together with all forms of hate, or ironically perhaps anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But wait, the perpetrators, we believe, who attacked the students at this or that university were themselves jihadists. Why are you linking anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as if they are umbilically connected? So part of it was still this reluctance to define the issue and its specificity. And the other part of it was the absence of consequences. We have today in the United States members of Congress, elected officials in both political parties who have voiced anti-Semitic views and have paid no price. To the contrary. And now to go a big step further, the consequence, I believe, of the deeper, darker forces, the money trails, the networking, have resulted in the biggest shock of all, that the largest concentration of Jews in the world outside of the state of Israel, and deemed by many to be the locus of cultural, economic, social, and political power, if you will, namely New York, has a mayor who is a product of the red-green alliance, the red, the leftist, the green, the jihadist, who won almost in a cakewalk, and who is now governing the most consequential American city, and has brought in people who make no pretense of where they stand, whether in support of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which, by the way, are proscribed groups under US law, dating back to President Clinton, or where they stand on Israel's very right to exist, or where they stand on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I can keep going. In New York City, had it happened perhaps in Seattle or Minneapolis, it would be disturbing, but one might rationalize it. But once it happened in New York, I think it's fair to say without hyperbole, Daniel, and this is a country that doesn't like hyperbole in its language, all bets are off. Because if it can happen in New York, it can happen perhaps anywhere in the United States, and potentially even in the single most important place, Washington, D.C. And within it, the White House and the United States Congress.
You referenced a number of reasons why anti-Semitism has flared up, not just in the United States, perhaps, but globally. One aspect is, as anti-Semitism has often been likened to a shape-shifting virus, it comes now both on the far left as well as on the far right, and for Islam is often disguised or in the form of Israel criticism or anti-Zionism. First of all, how do you define, or how do you see anti-Zionism? Is anti-Zionism, according to you, according to what you write in the book, inherently anti-Semitic, or only if it comes with the tropes of classical anti-Semitism? And how would you differentiate between what people then often claim is just a political statement, criticism, from what is anti-Semitism?
Please read the book, even if I answer Daniel's question, or try to. And again, I'm mindful I'd like to be succinct, but it's hard. I think that if we look at this from a historical perspective, and again, I'm simplifying, but nonetheless trying to make a point, for many centuries, the principal motif of anti-Semitism, of course, was religiously based. For Christians, again, I'm generalizing, but we, since there was eternal collective guilt, I can say we had killed the Son of God, the deicide charge. And on top of that, we had stubbornly, a word that's often associated with Jews, stubbornly refused to embrace the supersessionist Christian theology, or, if you will, the replacement theology. After all, in Christian terminology, the Hebrew Bible was called the Old Testament, not by accident, to be not replaced, but succeeded, if you will, by the New Testament. So on both counts, having killed Jesus and only being absolved, in inverted commas, of the charge in 1965 after almost 2 millennia, and having stubbornly clung to our own faith rather than embrace the new replacement faith, Christian anti-Semitism took root, and I thought I knew something, but in researching the book, it became so embedded not just in theology and politics, but in culture, in literature, in music, in every aspect of Western civilization. The most obvious examples are William Shakespeare in the figure of Shylock, Geoffrey Chaucer in the Prioress's Tale. I can keep going. Then along came Islam in the 7th century and only added to the religious focus of Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism was not coined till the 19th century, but whatever you wish to call it, Jew hatred, Judeophobia, the Shylock, whatever it was. And Islam viewed itself as showing some respect, but almost, if you will, a kind of condescending respect for the other monotheistic religions, while claiming the perfection of monotheism. Islam had become the last stage of the monotheistic journey. There would be no fourth stage, from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. And as you know, when the Jews in Medina and then Khaybar and elsewhere rejected Muhammad's overtures, they were slaughtered. And thus began a very complicated relationship, which should not be compared directly to the Christian journey. Each is somewhat different, but with the same conclusion, that there was enough in the theology to permanently target the Jews. By the 19th century, Daniel, particularly in countries like Germany, the notion of racial anti-Semitism first coexisted and began to kind of muscle out religious anti-Semitism as perhaps the principal form. And here, Jews were even more trapped, because in theory at least, there was an exit for Jews during the religious period, conversion. The conversions may or may not be treated respectfully, credibly, but there was in theory an out. When it became racially based, and of course the Nuremberg laws that took this from the 19th century to its, if you will, culmination, it became race. It no longer mattered whether you went to synagogue or not, whether you went to United Synagogue or Liberal Synagogue or Haredi Synagogue. It made zero difference. You had an immutable characteristic. But then, how shall I put this? Auschwitz gave that theory a bad name. And so for many in that camp, they had to go, if you will, into the shadows. Auschwitz was a step too far. Hitler had taken these notions, that extra mile. Stalin in his own way had too. So if you'll understand what I'm saying, they gave anti-Semitism a bad name. But given the fact that anti-Semitism, as we're told, is the world's oldest hatred, and as you said, Daniel, is shape-shifting, is extraordinarily adaptable, ingenious, creative. It wasn't long before those in the shadows were looking for the opportunity to come out of the shadows again. And here I submit that the rebirth of Israel, and I deliberately use the word rebirth of Israel, gave them the opportunity to create the third form of anti-Semitism. And again, it's not just what I said earlier about anti-Zionism, and someone will always say, but David, the Satmar are anti-Zionist. To me, that's a deflection. We all know, at least people of goodwill know, the Satmar have a very specific theological explanation that Israel is not a secular project. But to allow that to define the new stage would be misguided at best and malevolent at worst. And what's striking is not just this insistence, this obsessive insistence, and anti-Semitism is an obsession. It's a neurotic obsession. When you cross the line, and you see people today like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, they see anti-Semitism anywhere and everywhere. They see it in the rain, in the snow, in the stock market, in every decision made or reputedly made by a political leader. Everything is seen through the filter. But the other piece of this, Daniel, is that the charges leveled against Israel are in so many cases reawakened age-old tropes. Let me be clear. I'm not here to suggest that Israel is not immune from criticism. Read Haaretz. Listen to Knesset debates. Hear me talk about Israeli drivers on the highways. I don't mean to trivialize it. But we're not talking here about the kinds of debates that we ourselves cherish, that are also drawn, if you will, from the Talmudic tradition of civil debate. Fine. You like a leader, you don't like a leader, fine. I'm talking about age-old tropes that have been used against Jews and have now been transferred more safely and comfortably, so to speak, onto Israel, while insisting that some of my best friends are Jews. So Israel is now accused of the blood libel. It's not just that we're told almost gleefully by some in the press that Israel attacked a hospital in Gaza and 500 people were killed. But it's done almost ecstatically because it serves to reinforce the notion that Jews intrinsically, inherently, immutably are malevolent, are evil, seek the murder of hospital patients, seek the murder of children, seek to inflict the maximum damage, seek to impose starvation. And so many of these are just reworked, maybe not even reworked tropes, drawn from these thousands of years of unfolding anti-Semitism, now applied against the Jewish state with what some believe is the safety margin. Again, I'm not talking about Jews, I'm talking about Israel. But isn't it rather ironic that you're talking about the only Jewish majority nation on earth? And isn't it somewhat revealing that with all of your alleged obsession for human rights and civil rights and human dignity and human life, when tens of thousands of people in recent days were murdered by the Iranian government, where was your concern for human rights and civil rights and human dignity and human life? So, if you're consistent, okay, I may or may not like it, but there's a consistency. If you believe that no state should exist on the planet, and like the language Esperanto, we should have one world government, together with one world language, I may not like it, but I accept your consistency. But if you're going to single out Israel and only Israel, not just for its policies, but its very existence, its very legitimacy, I have no choice but to call you out. And I'm not going to play your quibbling games about whether you are or not an anti-Semite because your doctor is a Jew. You are an anti-Semite. The problem is that the stigma, such as it is, of being called an anti-Semite today is virtually nil. I said earlier, you can be a member of the United States Congress. You can be a television host. You can be an employer. And at the same time, harbor these views without looking over your right shoulder and your left shoulder about what consequences there might be. That's where we are, I fear.
Allow me one last question before we turn to the audience, and in order to make sure that people still read your book, although it's more than 260 pages, there's enough left for you. The New York Times columnist Bret Stephens recently caused a lot of controversy in the Jewish world because he argued that the traditional fight against anti-Semitism is a wasted effort. He said, used similar words that you just used. He called anti-Semitism a neurosis. You cannot educate people out of their neurosis, and therefore campaigned or argued for diverting our focus, redirecting our focus and our philanthropy away from this traditional fight and towards Jewish flourishing, towards building Jewish institutions, schools, etc. Where do you agree with Bret? Where may you perhaps differ from his approach?
He's a serious person, and perhaps some of you read him regularly, follow him, and I think his words need to be taken very seriously. And I have a lot of agreement with Bret Stephens. Let me talk about the agreement first, and then I'll move to the other piece of it. Allow me to personalize it. I was very lucky to be born and raised in the United States. I can say in all honesty that I never encountered anti-Semitism. Certainly not in any significant or scarring way. I think, speaking on behalf of my wife, I can also say that our 3 adult children growing up never experienced any hurdle or obstacle whatsoever to the pursuit of their life journey. But unfortunately, I can also say, Daniel, now as the grandparents of 8 Jewish grandchildren, that I know their lives will be different. I see it. It's not a matter of conjecture. It's already happening in the way our children have to choose schools. It's happening in the way our Hebrew-speaking daughter-in-law, our Israeli daughter-in-law, chooses to speak Hebrew or not in public, and at what decibel level. There's an awful lot going on. So where I completely agree with Bret Stephens is, unless and until we ensure that young people understand at a much more substantive, deeper level what being Jewish means, gain literacy, confidence, not hubris, but confidence, believing that there's something ennobling and enriching in being a Jew, then the rest, occasionally the need to stand up in a classroom or on social media or elsewhere and defend themselves, and by extension, the Jewish people, and yes, the state of Israel, unless that happens, I fear for what emerges among young Jews ahead. And that's why when Bret says more investment in Jewish schools, Jewish camping, Jewish experiences, yes, 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 for all the right reasons, both because intrinsically, even if things were great outside, yes, because too many of us receive a kind of superficial diet of what being Jewish means, and also because otherwise I fear we're going to have a thinning of the Jewish community. And I was having lunch with a very good friend who had converted to Judaism and was strenuously working to instill in her 2 children a deep, abiding commitment to their Jewish identity. Someone you know, by the way, who lives in Berlin. And her daughter at 14 came to the mother a couple of months ago and said, "Mommy, how do I opt out?" Opt out. And the mother asked, opt out of what? Opt out of being Jewish. And the mother said, "But why, Maya?" And the answer came back, "The price is too high." I can't believe that she's the only one who's wrestling with these issues. So all the more reason why I agree with Bret Stephens. Maybe he was also being provocative in his speech, and he certainly gained the attention of all of us, because here we are in London discussing the speech that he gave in New York a month ago or so. But the question still begs itself from an advocacy point of view. What is it that we should be doing? And here I've argued pretty much since October the 8th that we need an October 8th agenda for an October 8th world. And I liken too many of the, again, good, well-meaning organizations, and I speak principally of the United States, to the Polish cavalry in 1939. They were gallant on their white horses, their elegant uniforms. I'm sure the crowds in their villages and towns sent them off with flowers and cheers, and they went to meet the German blitzkrieg, and they were destroyed in a matter of days. I fear that too many are approaching the post-October 7th world and war on their beautiful white horses without understanding what we're up against. The reach of Qatar, the strategic genius of Qatar, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and how it has been penetrating the West. The Red-Green Alliance, which on its face seems so improbable because the values of each side are in contrast to one another. The hijacking of political parties. All of these things are happening, and I think most are a step or two or three behind. But I don't believe, Daniel, and I don't know how Bret Stephens would react, that we can give up this fight. The question is, how do we fight, and not just with what tools, but with what messages? And the principal message that I would give, this is just me, is not hate is ugly, or if your children don't have polio, thank 2 Jewish doctors, Sabin and Salk. Or if you like the cherry tomato in your salad, thank Israeli farmers. Or even now, if you like hockey, then thank a Jewish hockey player who won the game for the US team in the most anticipated hockey match against Canada in decades. I think we need to link the Jewish destiny to the destiny of the West, to the destiny of liberal democracy, of liberal democratic values, to make the point that Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory made on many occasions, that anti-Semitism may begin with Jews, it never ends with Jews. It's the first sign of an unhealthy society, and our societies appear increasingly unhealthy. The center has vanished to a large degree. The meeting place of different but reasonable points of view. And instead, we've become increasingly fragmented and polarized. And I believe that one of the goals has to be to divide the soft left from the hard left, and the soft right from the hard right. Because the hard left, and there are many historical examples and precedents, are using the soft left as useful idiots. We've seen it again and again and again. And the hard right is using the soft right as their useful idiots. And the language that the Muslim Brotherhood is using in the West is entirely different than the language it's using in Arabic or in its own homes elsewhere. I'll just give you one example. I know we want to get to the audience and questions. Look at 1979 and Iran, because that's very much in the news today. And look at how many otherwise intelligent, credentialed American and French leaders in particular. France, because Khomeini was living in France at the time. And obviously the US, Jimmy Carter was then president, was very much involved with what the future of Iran would look like. And look at how they chose to read Khomeini. It's astonishing. And Khomeini was smart enough, clever enough, knowing the West far better than we understood his theology, his ideology, his eschatology. He played the West like a fiddle. In the West, he spoke about himself as a social justice warrior. And lots of people love that. He spoke of himself as a moderating force who could bring together secular communities and others in Iran to replace the model of the Shah. And whether because of wishful thinking or naivete, maybe in a few cases complicity, but mostly I think wishful thinking and naivete, and a lack of understanding of the mindset of extremism, we played along. And now we all watch to see whether or not there will be kinetic warfare. And this comes 47 years after Khomeini returned with the involvement of the United States and France in particular. And by the way, if anyone wants to ask, I can also document for you how, in spades, this same failure of imagination, failure to grapple with reality as it is, failure to see what was in front of your nose, gripped this country, France, and many in the United States, from the release of Adolf Hitler in 1924 from the Landsberg prison, through January 1933 when he became chancellor, with the connivance of von Papen and Hindenburg, who believed that they could control Hitler, to March 23rd, 1933, when the enabling legislation allowed Hitler to circumvent the parliament. And by the summer, Hitler's Germany had become a one-party state / tyranny. So I feel, my wife often refers to herself as Cassandra, the Greek mythological character. But I feel that we Jews are somehow fated, not only to survive, yes, we will survive, I have no doubt, but also fated to be the Cassandra among the nations. We understand the notion of tyranny, and it's not by accident that tyrannies that my mother faced, my father faced, my wife faced, all shared the common objective of destroying the Jews. So my advocacy would focus less on really nice people. My children love to play football just like your children love to play football. My blood is as A positive or O as your blood is, and rather focus on, as Jonathan Sachs said, they may begin with the Jews, but the end is all of us as we know ourselves, our pluralistic values, our liberal values, our democratic values, and we must become those who shout from the rooftops.
Thank you, David. So, please. Let's turn to the audience. I believe there are microphones available. Please. The gentleman here.
Yeah, thanks. You reminded us a few moments ago that that Khomeini represented himself as a warrior for social justice. How should we address concepts such as social justice and international law, which have become so debased?
Might we take 2 or 3 questions?
Okay, yeah.
I'm afraid I'll go on too long with each question and frustrate all of us.
Let's, okay.
Maybe you jot down if you wouldn't mind, Daniel.
So much has changed.
I don't have a...
You talk about liberal democracy. Which,
where are you? Could you raise your hand?
Sorry, here.
Yeah, thank you.
You talk about liberal democracy, but what do you say about the extreme right-wingers in Israel who don't appear to be supporters of liberal democracy? They don't help our case, I think.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question. I'll be a Jewish Trinitarian, take 3. If there is a... I see, Daniel, I see some...
Yeah.
You may have friends in the audience, I know.
I was wondering if you could comment, has there ever been a previous form of Jew hate that's involved non-Jews, like anti-Semitism? So I stand on the street against demonstrations, pro-Palestinian demonstrations. The non-Jewish anti-Zionists are just as hated as I am. And I wonder if that's something that you'd like to comment on.
You said non-Jewish Zionists.
Yeah. Our allies seem just as hated as we are, and I wonder if that's something that we can utilize, something.
Well, maybe in the spirit of the Hebrew language, I'll go the opposite direction, from right to left. So I'll start here.
One more? Yeah.
No, I'll start.
Okay, you go.
I think what's instructive in this respect, sir, is the debate, the conversation that Tucker Carlson had with the U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee. I don't know that may be too American for some in the audience, but some people are nodding their heads, they've seen it, where both are non-Jews, but the US ambassador, Mike Huckabee, is a Christian Zionist, and I think has defined himself as such all his life. And Tucker Carlson, who represents sort of an isolationist, revisionist wing of the Republican Party that is increasingly anti-Semitic, was equally forceful in denouncing, in fact, I think perhaps even more forceful in denouncing Huckabee for his Christian Zionism, as if he somehow betrayed the Christian people. But Christian Zionism is deeply rooted within important segments of the Christian world, as we all know, and it's not a new phenomenon. And by the way, in the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States, there were any number of political leaders who were Christian Zionists who prayed and yearned for the return of the Jewish people and the restoration of Jewish sovereignty. So I think it's always important for us as a strategy, never more so than today, to consider the question of allyship. And I think particularly after October 7th, we need to re-examine who are our allies, who are our potential allies, and who may once have been our perhaps putative allies, but went missing in action. And I think, again, we've been, if I can say collectively, we've been a little slow to reconsider this. We are so emotionally and programmatically invested in certain relationships that it's hard for us to reassess them or even let go and look elsewhere. But we have many friends in the Christian world. They're not always in the places where we we have been frequenting in the past. I think we need to spend more time with those friends. The next question was the right wing. I, for one, I don't feel the need to have to defend every Israeli politician or even every Israeli official in order to defend Israel. I think we create for ourselves a trap. Would I wish that Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir were not part of the cabinet? Yes. Am I uncomfortable, even embarrassed by things they sometimes say? Yes. Is that unique to Israel and this Israeli government? No. Is that unique to Israel as a democratic nation? No. And I think if we raise the bar so high in the case of Israel, then I think we create an impossible standard to meet. That doesn't mean somehow letting go of the issue, ignoring it, pretending it doesn't exist. But at the end of the day, particularly after October the 7th, to me what happened on October the 7th was, in a way it comes also to the international law question, sir, to me what happened on October 7th was an act of genocide. Not October 8th, October 7th. It was genocidal intent. My wife is related through marriage to the Bibas children. There is no one on the other side, so to speak, who can convince me that the kidnapping of those children, children like it, not to mention all the others, was anything other than a bloodlust to kill as many Jews as possible. Didn't matter whether they went to synagogue or not, whether they liked Smotrich and Ben-Gvir or detested them. In fact, ironically, as we know, many of the kibbutzim in what was called the Gaza envelope were populated by people of the left who lived there very deliberately in order to extend their hands across the border to people in Gaza in many cases, to meet them at the border and drive them to Israeli hospitals for treatment that they couldn't get in Gaza. And so I say all of this because maybe you'll think I'm simplifying, but after October 7th, those who were looking for a third way, I'm not talking about a Tony Blair third way, but a third way, I think we're doomed to fail. You had Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, you had the patron saint, if you will, in Iran, and their goal was clear. And their cheerleaders at British universities and on the streets from Hyde Park Corner every Saturday marching through the city, and their equivalents in New York and Toronto and Sydney, to the best of my knowledge, never once held a placard saying, two-state solution. Never once held a placard saying, release the hostages, release the Bibas children, release the women. And some Jews, in my estimation, still wanted to live in their own bubble and distance themselves from the Israeli government in order to enhance their virtue signaling. Very nice, sitting perhaps in Belgravia or Brooklyn or Bethesda, but in the real world, where Israel was facing kinetic war on 7 fronts, a luxury Israelis could not afford. And finally, sir, if I understood your question, if I haven't forgotten, I think that an essential tool, particularly after October 7th, is lawfare. And here, I've had the pleasure of meeting and on several occasions interviewing Natasha Hausdorff, and those who work with her here in the UK, those in Israel who have done similar work, and those in the United States. I believe the importance of those institutions and organizations has increased tenfold. And I would hope that to the extent that we have organized communities rather than disorganized, fragmented communities, that those organizations engaged in lawfare, just like those organizations engaged in intensification of Jewish education, are the ones who are getting the support. Because otherwise, I think the support is, again, well-intentioned but misplaced. We're living in a very different world. I wouldn't give the extra money for the iftar dinner or the Passover interfaith Seder. The money should go for the best legal minds, the best approaches to intensification of Jewish knowledge and confidence and pride and literacy, and a much smarter, more algorithmic response to social media. And again, I come back to the work of ISGAP, which, by the way, I should add, is situated in the UK. Linda Blanchet is sitting here in the first row, has a presence at the Wolf Institute at Cambridge, has held summer institutes at Oxford University. My wife and I have attended the last 3. But these organizations that have rolled up their sleeves and flexed their muscles and said, we're going to present not just slogans or talking points. What we're going to present is cold, hard, revealing data. Data you can't afford to ignore. And if you do choose to ignore it, then in a sense, you're abdicating leadership and responsibility for protecting not just Jews, but for protecting the core values. And what ISGAP has said repeatedly, whoever wins the hearts and minds of the Ivy League and Oxbridge will determine the future. Right now, it looks as if we may be losing that battle. And it's high time for us to regain the momentum and to ensure that organizations like ISGAP, because of their research, because of their fearlessness, are supported, and their research is fed to the right people. And I've seen it work in the United States already. I've seen the linkage to presidential decisions and congressional initiatives. We need more of that.
I think we have time for one more round. The lady here.
We're not returning to the States till the end of the week, so we're here. As long as you have the Sitzfleisch.
Hi.
Where are you, please?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's hard to see.
I'm just following on from what you were just saying. From my perspective, the situation here in the UK, as things currently stand, goes way beyond any of what you've just mentioned. The infiltration and takeover of our most basic institutions. Look at the West Midlands police scandal, for example. The Palestine Action Court that got thrown out of court.
Right, the court decision.
I mean, it's just, to me, a tsunami that's out of control, well beyond what you're suggesting about the excellent work of something like ISGAP. I just wonder, how do we do damage limitation when all of this has become so entrenched in so many key institutions in our society?
Okay. No, please. I can't see anyone. I just see
the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Just to follow on what that lady said now, surely it's all very well to, follow the money and talk about the role of Qatar. But isn't there another aspect of this? And it's an aspect in which we as Jews have been very involved, which is we inadvertently played a role in our communities, in our attitudes to immigration, of enabling the arrival in Britain and in Europe and in many other countries of millions of anti-Semites, people whose views are not very different to those of the Nazis. People from Syria, people from Pakistan, which is, I spent a lot of time in, is one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world. And now they're here. And they have those beliefs. They don't need to be paid by the Qataris to have those beliefs. They had them already. And maybe we as Jews should seriously rethink our position and our behavior on these issues of culture and immigration. It's been pointed out by the hard right, but it's true in any case. And what would you say to that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, coming from a very different angle, could you say what you think of the influence of identity politics on the recent wave of anti-Semitism, or maybe the past 20 years or so? Because it seems to me it's all very well to talk about Muslims, and there is an element of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community, I'm not denying that. But it also seems to me, if you look at, you talked about the Ivy League universities and Oxbridge, elite universities all over the world, seems to me identity politics is very, very strong, created in those universities, and really provides a kind of fuel for anti-Semitism. So, very briefly, this idea that the world is divided into identity groups, people of colour at the bottom, white people are at the top, Jews, this is not my view, I'm summarising their view, Jews are hyper-privileged people, Israel represents white supremacy in the Middle East. Seems to me if we're going to tackle anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, we really need to take these ideas seriously and push back against them.
Thank you. Okay.
Maybe those two more.
I'm not going anywhere.
You offered it.
It's my pleasure, so to speak.
Fascinating evening. Thanks, gents. In relation to the Christian world, a few years ago we might have had a feeling that Christian anti-Semitism was something of the past. We'd seen a lot of pronouncements going back to 65 from the Pope and so on. But that seems to be a resurgence in many parts of the world, in Europe and also in the USA. What would you note about that?
I hope you're saving the softball question for last. Was there one more?
Oh, thank you.
My wife is pointing to someone.
Yes, I'll ask one. You mentioned earlier that anti-Semitism is cancerous. If in London it's stage 1, in New York City it seems to have infiltrated into the politicians in power, perhaps it's stage 2. I was wondering if there was a warning and some advice you could give Londoners on how we don't get to the same situation.
Daniel.
Yes, my thoughts over the last 2.5 years is actually it is not as bad now as I thought it would be on October 7th, 2023. And if it is so bad, why are there Jewish cabinet ministers in Parliament? Why are there flights from Israel going to all the major cities of Europe, including Moscow, and about 5 or 6 flights to Abu Dhabi? Please explain that. It's a complete conundrum, which I can't understand, and nobody's explained to me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Help me, Daniel.
1 minute per question.
Well, what were the questions? I think I'll go in reverse order. Look, two things can be true at the same time. One can have one or more Jews in city government or state or national federal governments. That's not necessarily a firewall against resurgence of anti-Semitism. And it's very interesting because to the extent that I'm a student of any subject other than this, it's the period of the 1930s. Obviously it's the war itself, but it's really, and it kind of courses through some of the questions. What happened between 1924, or 1923, if you will, and 1939? Because unless and until we answer that question, which has contemporary application, then I think we're missing important parts of the analysis and the results of the analysis. In December 1924, the New York Times, the newspaper of record in the United States, had an article whose headline was, and I quote, "Hitler tamed by prison." It said that Hitler had just been released after 9 months in Landsberg, where he had written Mein Kampf, meaning he had no secrets. He put it out there. And yet, if you read subsequent analyses, I'm taking you through 1939, of David Lloyd George as ex-prime minister, of Ramsay MacDonald, of Stanley Baldwin, of course of Neville Chamberlain, of Harold Lasky, a Jew, at my alma mater, the London School of Economics, of Walter Lippmann, another Jew, considered the most prominent foreign policy journalist in the United States. You will see the consistent failure of imagination and the temptation to want to believe that Hitler's language was hyperbolic, that once in power, power tends to moderate. And I'll add something else because of your question, sir. There were a number of Jews in the Roosevelt administration. Henry Morgenthau was the Secretary of the Treasury. FDR's principal speechwriter and some of his key advisors were Jews. They chose, Morgenthau being an exception in 1944, when his intervention led to the War Refugee Board, which in turn hired Raoul Wallenberg, who was sent to Hungary, and you know the work of Wallenberg. But those Jews, and it's been said by Yad Vashem and others, did not want to live their public lives at that time as Jews. And I think that gets to the essence of it. There is a Jewish president of Mexico today. I don't know that it matters at all in the life of the Jews of Mexico that she is the president or not. She doesn't see herself as the Jewish president or even as a Jew who holds the highest office. I think Volodymyr Zelensky is a slightly different model. And I mention his name very consciously because in Kiev, in about 2 or 3 hours, will mark the 4th anniversary of the Russian invasion, and we should all be mindful of it, even as we talk about other issues tonight. But he has at times mentioned his Jewish connection, but it has not stopped Ukraine from almost consistently voting against Israel in the United Nations General Assembly. So the notion of, but there are Jews, is not a simple notion. And by the way, I can also cite for you, but we're in London, not New York, a number of Jewish notables in New York City using those 3 infamous words, as a Jew, endorsed Zohran Mamdani, endorsed him even as globalized the Intifada, from the river to the sea, creation of Students for Justice in Palestine at his college up in Maine, support for the BDS movement, etc., etc., etc. So the simple fact that there are Jews doesn't necessarily signal support for us. On the other hand, it signals a society which has not completely unraveled in terms of appointments, and that raises the question about identity politics. Had we had more time, big on my list is what we call DEI, the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, which is one of the hallmarks of the woke ideology in the United States. And I'm on the record as one of those who says we have to confront DEI because it has shaped the nature of our contemporary society. Jewish enrollment at the Ivy League universities has largely plummeted. Jews are no longer of interest under the category of diversity. At my alma mater in the United States, according to the administration, we were as much as a third of the student population some 10, 15 years ago. Now we're 12%. Unless you accept the notion that Jews have become dumber, what are the other explanatory explanations? The fact that, by and large, humanities and social science faculties are populated by people, we see it again and again and again, certainly in the United States, who are hostile to Israel, hostile to Zionism, often hostile to capitalism, often hostile to the United States, has an impact. Coming to this side of the room, I deliberately wanted to be very careful. I did not want to come as an overbearing American who has answers for the Jewish community in Britain. Though I lived here for 4 years, our son just moved back after 8 years in London. 3 of our grandchildren are British citizens. I don't think it's for me to come, whether for a day or a week, and to say, here's how we do it elsewhere, here's how ISGAP sees the world, follow our advice. You have extraordinarily capable people here. You have some extraordinary institutions. CST has been the model for other Western countries that thought perhaps they were immune and are quickly trying to learn from CST and catch up. As I mentioned, UK Lawyers for Israel has been doing some amazing work, and I can keep going. But at the end of the day, we also have to be realistic about what our toolbox contains. And who the decision makers are. So if there's a strategy to influence existing decision makers at 10 Downing Street, in the Houses of Parliament, you'll know better than I what that strategy ought to be. If not, and there's an electoral strategy for whenever the next election is, you'll know that better than I. And if there's a tipping point at which life as a Jew becomes untenable for many in Britain, and the decision comes whether to leave, and if so, where to go, Israel or elsewhere, you'll know that much better than I. In the meantime, thank goodness you have the Jewish Chronicle that brings us together, but it would be an act of sheer chutzpah on my part, I believe, to come and say, here's what you need to do. And when you ask about New York City, we failed. It would be a double act of chutzpah to come and say, based on our failure in New York, here's what you should do in the UK. We failed. In that concentration, as I said, of 1 million or more Jews in every nook and cranny of New York City life, we failed. And I'll tell you one of the reasons we failed, which I think is applicable elsewhere, because we were fragmented. Because even in a time of, if you will, war declared on the Jewish people, if not kinetic war, then a war against synagogues now, and kosher restaurants, and Jewish community centers. You saw what happened in Brisbane, Australia the other night, a truck ramming into the entrance. You saw the only Ethiopian Jewish restaurant in New York forced to close. I don't have to tell you in Britain what you've seen, but I can say in the United States, do we have a war mindset? No. Do we have a war cabinet? No. Do we have a General Montgomery or General Eisenhower or General Marshall to lead us? I don't see it. So in that respect, I see similarities to Yad Vashem's assessment of American Jewry during the Second World War. The competition between organizations, the egotistical questions that inevitably surfaced, the nuanced, if not major differences in outlook, all led to a disunited Jewish community at the time of our greatest peril. Was a single message delivered to President Roosevelt on behalf of 5 or 6 million American Jews, or were multiple messages depending on who had access at a given moment in time? And I understand the competitive nature of Jewish life. I lived it for many decades. I understand the notion that everyone agrees we're Am Echad, one people, but we're first among equals. But my takeaway for this evening and evenings like this is, unless we understand that there is an 8th war, in addition to the 7 kinetic fronts that Israel has faced, and that 8th war is a global front that is increasingly assertive, self-confident, and blurring the differences between Jews, Israelis, Judaism, and Zionism. Unless we understand it and come to terms with it and bring the smartest people for that kind of a war, not another kind of war. This is not the war of social workers right now or do-gooders alone. This is the war that the people who created Silicon Valley and our Jews need to help us grapple with. This is the kind of war where the 20-year-olds who've had the extraordinary courage and backbone and spine to stand up in their university settings and in some cases in the United States, sue their universities in court. They need to be at the table. And unless we're talking to those people, the frontliners, the people who are facing this on a daily basis, and the creative geniuses who invented whole new languages of communications and interaction and technology, those are the two main sources that I look to. Are they at the table? Are they the war cabinet, or even in the war cabinet? If there is a war cabinet, maybe. I'm sure there are things I don't know. But from my vantage point, I don't see it. And that, to me, is part of the problem. Israel recovered from October the 7th. We can dwell as much as we want on the conceptia that Hamas would not attack. You know, we can regurgitate. But by October the 8th and 9th and 10th, Israeli genius had come together in spaces, bringing together the best minds. And 2 years later, look at the change in the strategic situation. I want a spinal transplant. I want a spinal transplant from, forget the political leadership. I want a spinal transplant from those 21 and 22 and 23-year-old Israeli men and women, Druze, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, who flew back from Goa, where they were on vacation, who flew back from the salt flats in Bolivia, where they were on vacation, because they were called up to the IDF. And they knew in going back that they were risking their lives, and went back, and went into the booby-trapped tunnels, and then developed the beepers for Hezbollah, and changed the government in Syria, and weakened Iran markedly, and took the battle to the Houthis. What I'm saying, maybe as a concluding comment, Daniel, is before we succumb to despair, we Jews are commanded never to succumb to despair. We are the people of tikva, of hope. If Israel, facing the genocidal threats, could recover and take the battle to the enemy, then we here, faced with the challenge at the universities, in the human rights organizations, in some political parties and spaces, can do no less. And if it takes a spinal transplant from those members of Sayeret Matkal, Sayeret Duvdevan, Unit 8200 and the others, let's have the spinal transplant. Because at the end of the day, this is about our grandchildren's future. I speak very selfishly. It's also about the future of the Jewish people. And it's about the future of the West as we know it. Never allow the two to be separated.